I'll just kick it off. This event is called Green Drinks Park Ridge, and we normally meet in Park Ridge, Illinois, the third Tuesday of the month over drinks. And we have a variety of speakers. And this month we were unable to meet together. And we had talked to Wharton Sinkler last month about Citizens Climate Lobby, and he had suggested Alan as a speaker. Alan Metzger is our speaker today. And because, well, we had to cancel our speaker this month because our project was affected by COVID. And so I reached out to Alan, and he was very happy to join us. He set up the Zoom for us. Alan is a layperson. He's not trained in nuclear technology, but he's the legislative outreach coordinator for Generation Atomic, 501c3 in Minnesota. And he's a self-described liberal, democratic environmentalist. So I'll let him do the rest of the talking. Welcome, Alan.
Hey, thanks for having me. Let me find the right screen here to share. So how does that look? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Okay, good.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, so I'm not going to mute everybody, but if you could mute yourself if you're not asking a question or something, that'll help extra sounds from entering the conference with this many people. It happens for sure. Thanks again for having me, Cindy and everybody. I've been meaning to get to a green drinks thing of some sort or another for like months or years even, and I just never have managed to do it on a day that I have off. I have lots of evenings off now these days, so it worked out. So tonight I'm going to talk about nuclear energy, and specifically I'm going to talk about nuclear energy as we have it here in Illinois. We've got some unique things that we can say about it here, and so this is a presentation that I put together with significant help from my lovely wife to really talk about nuclear energy here and do it in a way that would help people understand better the role that it plays in our energy mix, our electricity mix, and the benefits that we get from it. So let's go ahead and find the right window and start what I wanted to do. There we go. Okay, so Illinois is first in nuclear energy in a number of ways. We, of course, had the first man-made fission reaction that was created under the grandstands at the University of Chicago back in the days during World War II, the Manhattan Project. They put a big pile of graphite blocks together and shoved a bunch of uranium slugs into it and made it happen. And that was the first artificially created controlled fission reaction. There had been a little bit of fission here and there in some labs around the world, but only kind of by accident and nothing in a controlled way. And it also is there's natural fission reactors that happened over in Africa in a place called Oklo, which happened a few million years ago. So we can't really claim to have the first fission reactions, but the first man-made controlled ones, we absolutely can own that. So again, I was part of the Manhattan Project. And out of that project and the people that worked on it came Argonne National Labs, which is currently located in Lamont, Illinois. I don't think it's probably going to move anytime soon. And that lab, there was a lot of nuclear research done at that lab, and basically all of the designs for any of the nuclear reactors that have been built in the world can trace their roots back to work done at Argonne National Labs. So that was of course all done in Illinois. Illinois today has 6 nuclear power plants with 11 reactors between them. Some of them have 2. All of them have 2 except for 1, and that's the odd one. So we have 11 reactors, and that's the largest number of plants and reactors of any state. So in the United States, there is no other state that has that much nuclear energy as part of their electricity mix. And we're number 2 when it comes to total clean energy. And the reason that we're only number 2 instead of number 1 is that Texas is really big and they have a lot of wind. And so they've got lots of wind power down there. They do have a nuclear plant as well, but most of that clean energy is, as you can see on this graph, most of that clean energy is wind. I call it other renewable. I think they do have some solar down there, but it's largely wind. As you can see, the light green bar here in Illinois is bigger than any of the other light green bars, and that's our nuclear mix from our power mix. So, and our other renewable is mostly wind as well. So some key facts about the nuclear power plants that we have here in Illinois. Over half of our electricity that we generate in this state is from our nuclear plants, just those 6 relatively small nuclear plants. They're not big installations at all. They're from a square footage perspective, they're pretty small, and they produce 52.2% of the state's electricity, and they don't emit any greenhouse gases or other pollutants. It just as normal operation. They just make the heat and generate the steam that makes the turbines turn and the electricity comes out. So it's also nuclear is our most reliable power source. You know, when we have polar vortexes and when we have high demand times in the summer when everybody has their air conditioning on and all of those kinds of times, the nuclear reactors are all running at full tilt during all that time, and they rarely go down in an unplanned fashion. They do have to refuel once every 1.5 years or 2 years, but most of the time they don't trip at all. So they're workhorses, and they're very reliable ones at that. And our nuclear plants employ just under 6,000 people directly. As we'll see, there's more jobs that are associated with those, but there are almost 6,000 people that work at or for those nuclear plants. So we look at our electricity generation mix in a different way, in a graphic way. You can see there's that 52% that's nuclear. The bad news is we got a big old piece of black coal over there. That's for another part of the graphic here, and that's 32% of our electricity is still generated with coal, and that's unfortunate, and that represents work that we have to do. Fossil gas, or natural gas, I call it fossil gas, generates another 9% of our energy, and then we get that little sliver of wind in there as well. So to just give you a better idea. Oh, and I just mentioned that there is some solar that we have. It's too small for this graph, the percentages. It's just not very much at all, but we do have some. If you look at per unit of energy generated, the CO2 emissions, this is how greenhouse gas dirty a power source is. And coal is, of course, at the top of the list of being the worst. So 979 grams, almost a kilogram of CO2 that comes out for every kilowatt hour of electricity that a coal plant produces. Fossil gas is quite a bit better than that, about half, but it's still a pretty high number. Solar panels clock in at a much lower number. That's much more acceptable. In my view, anything under 100 is a good source. So we always shoot for the double digits or single digits. And then nuclear and wind are relatively equal in terms of how much CO2 they emit per kilowatt hour. And in both of those cases, you don't think of these sources as emitting anything when they operate, but you have to build them. And when you build them, you have to use concrete, which results in a lot of CO2 being released into the atmosphere. So that's an amortized number over the life of the plant or the windmill. Um, the amount of CO2 that, on average, is emitted when you look at the entire plant's lifetime and all the energy that it's going to produce, and then do the math.
Alan, do you mind if I ask what the IPCC is, the source?
Okay, so that's the I always want to say interplanetary. It's International Panel on Climate Change. So these are the go-to people that tell us that 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius is a something of a point that we should try to limit our warming to, and what it would cost to do that. So they produce quite large studies, and they're kind of the gold standard with regard to those kinds of studies, because they have lots of resources. They're an internationally funded organization, and lots of climate scientists and other kinds of scientists that contribute to those things. So
that's good to know. And do you mind if people ask questions, or do you want them to save them?
No, it's
Okay.
I'm here all night.
Great.
So I'm happy to have questions. So when we look at emissions in a graphical form, and I made a little donut this time, that 32% of coal that we that generates the coal that generates 32% of our electricity generates 86% of our CO2 emissions. So you can see why that big black bar at the top of the other graph, this is where it comes into play. So the fossil gas, even though it's only 9% of our generation, it produces 12% of our emissions, CO2 emissions. And then the nuclear plants represent 2% about. They're, again, most of that's already been emitted. They've already been built. The concrete's already been poured. And there's a little bit of emissions that you can associate with the nuclear plant for, they have to test emergency generators once in a while, and so those things emit something. And the people that work there have to drive to work. So those are kind of the emissions that you associate with the nuclear plant operation, because they do happen, but it's those are pretty small numbers. And then there's a little bit of emissions in there for some miscellaneous things. That's and it rounds to zero. So, and that's going to include solar and solar and maybe the hydro. We've got some very, very, very small hydro plants. So air pollution happens when you have something that is not zero emissions, and that's generally speaking going to be fossil fuel plants. So the big three from an emissions point of view are the sulfur dioxide, the nitrogen oxides, I call them SOx and NOx. SOx is another abbreviation that's used for sulfur dioxide sometimes, and then CO2. And CO2 is, of course, the greenhouse gas, and that's the climate change issue we have. So the nuclear plants that we have prevented this much pollution in 2018. It's just 1 year. So almost 70 million metric tons of CO2 was not emitted because those plants are running. And of course, the NOx and the SOx, that's the stuff that kills people in the short term. So you can directly correlate premature deaths from that kind of pollution, because people with asthma, others that are, and this is particularly hard on, people that are not as well off as most of us are. So it's the minorities and and poor people suffer more than some of the rest of us do because of those things. Partly because of where it comes out, and partly because their healthcare isn't as good typically. Those kinds of things. So we really want to avoid all of these emissions, but for different reasons. The first two, because it kills people. Normally operating coal plant or gas plant just kills people in its normal operation. You can just do the math and figure that out. There have been studies done about that some pretty firm numbers associated with that. We call it a death print sometimes. So, per unit of energy, how many people die because of the things that you do to create that energy. And so for fossil fuels, those numbers are pretty high, especially for coal. So we talked a little bit about reliability before, and this is a table that has all of the reactors that we have here in Illinois shown, and the uptime, or the we'll say average uptime over a 3-year period. All of these plants, when they were first built, generally probably were somewhere in the 60s in terms of the percentage of time that they were actually operating at their full capacity. And this is called a capacity factor. Essentially, it's if the plant runs all the time at its rated capacity, then it's got a 100% capacity factor. If you have to turn it off for any reason, or if you have to back it off to produce less energy than it's designed for any reason, then the number will go down. Generally speaking, the only reason that these numbers go down ever is because they have to refuel the reactors every 1.5 years or 2 years, depending on the model, depending on the actual plant. So the average amongst all of them, if you add them all together, is over 96% of the time that they're up. And those refueling outages are typically 5 or 6 weeks in duration. They bring in hundreds and hundreds of extra workers to do all the work that needs to be done. They do all the maintenance, all the refurbishment, everything in addition to the refueling, because they're down anyway and they want to take advantage of that downtime. And so that's a 24/7 operation that goes for that whole time. And the number of people working at the plant generally triples during that period, and the communities that those plants are in benefit greatly economically from all those people being in town and having to have a place to stay and a place to eat and things to buy and that sort of thing. So, so this is again an illustration of how reliable these are. Capacity factors for other kinds of electricity sources are shown here, and these are averages from the U.S. Department of Energy. The second and third ones, we just talked about the nuclear, so I won't rehash that. But the second and third ones, and the fourth one, so the natural gas, the coal, and the hydropower, we turn those plants off and on as a course of normal business, during the course of normal business, because we may need more energy on the grid or less energy on the grid. And so those are dispatchable, we call them. We can turn them on and off, and we can use them to level out the, make sure that the input of the grid equals the output of the grid, because it always has to. And so they are capable of running at higher capacity factors if we want them to, but generally speaking, we don't have to. The wind and solar capacity factors at the bottom generally represent as much as we can get out of those two technologies, because they are weather dependent. So, the wind blows and we get electricity from the windmills, and the sun shines and we get photovoltaic output from the solar panels. So that just kind of give you an idea for comparison purposes. The nuclear plants that we have are largely located in the northern third of the state. This is where the population is, and that's primarily why. We have one plant that's farther south. It's about an hour outside of Springfield, I think, maybe a little bit more. And that's Clinton, and that's the one that has just one reactor. The rest of them all have two. The blotches of color that you see are the counties that they're located in. And of course, the plant itself, on a map of this scale, you wouldn't be able to see it at all. They're pretty tiny. And one of these, the Zion plant up in the Zion station, up in the upper right-hand corner, that's actually closed. It was shut down in 1998, which because they had I think it was a large component that failed, and ComEd, who owned it at the time, just didn't want to spend the money to fix it, and so they decided to close it down. So it is in its final stages of decommissioning. I think it's going to be turned back over to Exelon now. It'll be for ownership after it's all of the equipment and buildings are removed, and that's going to be probably in 2021, maybe a year or two out. And the way those things work is the company that decommissions it actually takes ownership and owns the license, because there's still nuclear material there, so you have to have a license. And they do all the work, and then they give ownership back to the company that hired them at the end of their work, and so that's what's going to happen. So at some point, Exxon will have to decide what to do with that space, and we'll see. Oh, and I'll mention that all of these are located in rural communities. You know, the Waukegan one, the Zion one is a little different than that, but of course it's not running anymore. There's a cluster of 3 down by Morris and Kankakee in that area. There's one out by pretty close to Rockford, one in the Quad Cities, which is not right out in the country, but it's not really near the large population centers there. And then the Clinton station is kind of in the middle of the country. So the benefits that we get economically and from an employment perspective here are significant. As I mentioned, we have almost 6,000 highly skilled jobs, and I don't mean to imply that those are all jobs that are you know, masters or PhDs in physics or nuclear science or something. Excuse me. Many of those jobs are craftspeople, so specialty welders, plumbers, pipe fitters. There's a lot of that kind of work that's required at a nuclear plant on an ongoing basis, and so you know, you'll have you know, maybe 800 people that actually work there, and of course they have to staff it around the clock. So you're going to have, you know, operators that are always on duty, and people that do the work of any sort, really. Could be there any time of the day or not any shift. There are tens of thousands of additional jobs that are indirectly associated with these nuclear plants, many of which would go away if the nuclear plant's closed. And these are jobs that are either with Exelon, the company that runs these plants, or with their suppliers, or people that provide services for them. If we look at just the northernmost 4 plants, that number that's associated with the jobs number associated with just those 4 plants is 22,000. I couldn't find a number for all of the plants, so that's the one that I'm using. But there's a lot of people that do work and get a paycheck because of those plants. And of course, they generate electricity. They sell a lot of it. It's worth millions and millions of dollars, and so they pay taxes. And generally, the communities that they're in depend on those taxes for significant portions of funding their schools, their emergency services, their governments, things that they need to pay for. So that's to the tune of $180 million on a typical year, state and local taxes. And then there are about 6,500 companies that in some way or another do business with those nuclear plants. So they owe part, maybe all, but part of their business certainly to the fact that those nuclear plants are there. So we do have an abundance of clean, reliable energy available to us. We have a lot of work to do, as we saw with the coal, the coal that we talked about in the 2 graphs, the 3 graphs. But we have quite a bit of clean energy, and it is quite reliable. But it's at risk. So we could lose some or even all of this over time. And this is what I want to help us understand better as well. There is a significant chance that some of these plants could be closed prematurely. So this is one of those things where you have a big corporation, Exelon. They own and operate these plants. Quad Cities has a minority ownership by another company, but otherwise it's 100% Exelon. And these are assets that Exelon owns and operates, and they have fixed costs with them. So these people that you hire that work at the plants, their salaries are paid all the time. If you back the power output of the plant off, all you lose is revenue. You don't really gain any savings in fuel or savings in labor or anything like that, like you might at a coal or a gas plant. So so they are really built to be running all the time, and sometimes the market doesn't support that well. So it's a very complicated thing, but essentially the bottom line is that Exelon has said to their shareholders, because they're required to say things like this, which is we we don't have the kind of profitability that we would like to have out of these plants. We think we could do better somewhere else, and if we don't get if there isn't a way forward to improve that situation, we could choose to close one or more of these plants down, even though all of them is in perfect operating condition and paid for. It's just a matter of where they put their money, where they invest their money and the return that they get on that money. And if they decide that they can get more money somewhere else, their shareholders are going to want them to go to that somewhere else. That's just kind of how that works. So like I said, it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's kind of the bottom line. And one thing that I really want you to remember that's and a lot of people don't realize is that once Exelon decides to close one or more of those plants, it cannot be reopened. There's a number of reasons for that, but the main one is that the way that the licensing works with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, once you give up that operating license and give it back to the NRC, and you don't have it anymore, at that point, the NRC is basically assuming anything could happen at that plant with any of the things that are there that are supposed to be maintained and monitored. And so if you want to start operating again, you're going to have to start from scratch and do all of the basically start the licensing process from scratch, and that could be $100 million endeavor. I mean, it's just a huge process. It's one that every big plant like this had to go through when it was built. And nobody is going to pay to do that again. So the bottom line for us is that, again, that can be a little complicated too, but once you shut it down, it can't be restarted. So that's a one-way street. And we do not want to close any of these nuclear plants down because they're providing a huge amount of clean electricity, clean, reliable electricity for us. So we can't mothball them. There's some people that are talking about maybe creating a way to do that, to put them in mothballs for a while, but right now there is no way to do that. So so we are stuck without it if it closes. So why are these a risk of closure? Well, I mentioned what Exelon's view of it is, what I believe it is. They don't talk to me any more than they talk to you probably, but from what I've seen in the papers and from what I know about the market, that's kind of their approach. The deregulated energy market, which is what we're in. So basically, anybody can be a generator in Illinois and hook up to the the electrical wires and start producing energy and selling it, and then ComEd will deliver it. ComEd owns the wires that go to your house. But from a generation perspective, Exelon is in competition with other companies that own gas plants and coal plants and other sources of electricity, wind power and solar power. And as I mentioned before, the nuclear plants have fixed costs. So that's really, it doesn't matter what kind of what kind of flexibility the nuclear plant might have in terms of ramping its power up and down to match the grid or anything like that. Those costs are going to stay the same no matter what. So it's always a money losing proposition for Exelon when they have to back off because there's too much energy on the grid. And so sometimes that means that they actually have to pay. There's a negative price on electricity in some situations where they might actually have to pay to continue to allow their plant to generate, because that's how the operator of the grid in those areas will that's the signal that they will send when they need more or less energy, is they'll change the price that you get for it. And so it's like I said, it can get pretty complicated, and I certainly don't understand all the details of it. So other reasons, fossil fuels are cheap. So fracked gas is really cheap. Fracked gas during the fracking revolution, that happened over the last 15 years or so. The price of natural gas went down by an order of magnitude, just by a lot. So it's cheap, but coal is still cheap too. So fossil fuels are not expensive. We don't have oil plants really so much anymore, but the gas and the coal plants, the fuel is cheap for them, and they don't have to pay for what goes up their chimney. So there's no price on carbon here. Warren talked to you last month about Citizens Climate Lobby and the carbon fee and dividend approach that they would like to see implemented. I would very much like to see that. If the gas plants and the coal plants had to pay for the CO2 that goes up their chimney, it would level the playing field a lot, and I don't think we'd be having this discussion about nuclear plants being at risk. So that's a big reason. Nuclear energy is heavily regulated. It always has been. Except for the very, very early, and no, actually, even in the early days it was. So with that regulation comes costs that the nuclear industry has to bear. There's additional people they have to hire. There's additional things that they have to do to make sure their plants operate according to the safety standards that are dictated by the regulations. So all of that costs money. There is generally, I find, a lack of appreciation of the important role that nuclear energy plays in our lives, not only our present energy mix, but also the future. Going forward, none of these plants is ready to close. And they're all going to be able to serve us for decades to come if we take care of them, and we appreciate them. So that's part of why I love to talk to people about this, because I think it helps get that message out. And then there are certainly plenty of people that have fear of nuclear energy for one reason or another. They might be afraid of what they think the nuclear waste could do, or that if there's a meltdown, what are we going to do if there's a Chernobyl that's going to happen in Illinois? Those kinds of things. So there are people that have fears about that, and certainly those fears can be addressed, but they should be acknowledged, and we shouldn't be making fun of people or putting them down if they fear nuclear energy. We should be helping them understand what it is and what it isn't, which can help them be more help ease that situation for them. So if our nuclear plants are closed, if any of them are closed, we are not going to have the benefits that we just talked about. So all of the clean energy, all of the emissions that were avoided because we have these nuclear plants, they would appear again, because the only thing that's going to replace plants of this size are gas plants and coal plants. That's really it. We're not going to replace them with wind or solar anytime soon. Over time, perhaps that could happen. And if we do build enough so that we can turn them all off and everything's clean already, then that's one thing. But we don't have anything near that situation right now. So so we would see a big emissions spike, which I think I have a separate bullet for. So maybe I'm ahead of myself. Electricity prices, depending on who you ask and which analysis they did, this might be a little bit different, but the analysis that I've seen indicates that the moderation factor that the nuclear plants have, not only stabilizing the electric grid itself, the electricity on the grid, but actually the prices for that electricity, because nuclear plants generally have a pretty steady price that they're able to offer. That helps keep energy prices in general down, and so if they go away, there will be some increase in price. This analysis talked about almost $500 million just annually if those northernmost 4 plants are closed, that we would see as increased rates. We talked about emissions going to the roof. That would certainly happen. That's probably my biggest concern is once those things go offline. If they go offline, then we are going to see gas plants probably in neighboring states and coal plants in neighboring states that would pick up that slack. You know, we're all connected, right? Illinois doesn't just make electricity for Illinois, we make it for other states as well. We're actually a net exporter of electricity right now because of these nuclear plants. We would be transformed into an importer of dirty energy if any of those plants were closed down. So, and I'll just remind you again that a one-way street of closing a nuclear plant is in fact a one-way street. You can't undo that. So, what can we do? Well, what I do in all of my spare time, and I'm not a professional lobbyist. I'm a telecommunications engineer that I work a few days a week, and the rest of the time I try to spend talking to people about clean energy like this. But I spend a lot of time with Illinois politicians, state politicians, so Illinois state reps and state senators, and I talk to them about just how important these plants are to us, because in their hands is the ability to prevent the closure of some of these plants. So I want to make sure they understand that. And the CEJA bill, which is the Clean Energy Jobs Act, and boy, Dan Hunt, you helped me out. I don't remember the number of it, although it'll probably get changed into something else before it gets passed. But
Lisa probably knows that. We have a climate lobby.
No, Lisa doesn't. Well, you had your chance. It's everybody knows what CEJA is. So I think that's all we need, but it's got a provision in it that includes a fixed resource requirement, and it includes the removal of the generation assets in Illinois from the system operator's capacity auction. And that was a whole bunch of stuff that maybe didn't really make sense to you, but there's an auction that happens at like a state or a multi-state level, and the generators that are in that area all can bid on that auction. And what they bid for, one of the things they can bid for is to have the capacity, a certain amount of capacity for a certain time period available. So in other words, that's the way that the system operator has of guaranteeing that we're always going to have enough electricity. So you have generators that will bid on that. That process can be won or lost because it's an auction. And the people that have cheap fuel, like the gas plants and the coal plants, could win that auction over a nuclear plant because the nuclear plant just wouldn't have a low enough cost to be able to do that. And there's a new rule coming up that might prevent them from taking advantage of any subsidies that we give them even. And this is true for both solar, for all clean energy, solar and wind and nuclear. So pulling ourselves out of that capacity auction market and allowing the Illinois Power Agency, a state agency, to run that instead, to do that procurement, that power procurement instead, allows us as a state, allows the legislators to pass legislation that would create this fixed resource requirement, which says we need this much clean energy, and that's a requirement from us. If you give us that requirement, then we'll guarantee you that you've got that market. And that amount of fixed energy is big enough that the nuclear plants have to be part of it. So, so that's an oversimplified and probably not entirely 100% correct way of talking about it. I don't pretend to be an expert in that area, but the bottom line is that there is a way that we could fix this legislatively, provide Exelon with the relief that they need so that they don't have to enter that auction and run the risk of losing it. So that's, and that is part of the CG bill today. It's essentially, it's a subsidy because we're saying we're going to guarantee that you get that business, but we want the clean energy, and that's what we should be doing for clean energy sources, is giving them a leg up so that they can compete against the dirty ones, until such time at least as we have the dirty ones have to pay for their dirt, for the things that go up their chimneys. So so tell your legislators, support CEJA. If there are changes and amendments to CEJA, make sure that they still include this fixed resource requirement. And if you want to really make it simple, you could just say save the nukes, and hopefully they'll know what you mean by that. So that's my presentation. I kind of blew through it and I didn't stop and ask if there were questions, so maybe there are some now. And I'm gonna click unmute all. So mute yourself again if you're not talking, but sometimes it sticks and you can't unmute if you want. So. Questions?
Hi, my name is Andrea. I've got a question. You mentioned briefly about some concerns about nuclear plants, such as the nuclear waste, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more, kind of what this, how concerned should we be, and what are the
About nuclear waste? Sure. Let me, I'm going to mute everybody again so that we can get rid of a little bit of noise here, and then I'll talk about that. So you should be able to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. So nuclear waste is generally the thing that we're talking about there from power plants, is the fuel assemblies. So nuclear fuel is little uranium dioxide pellets. They're put in a rod, a metal rod stacked up, and then a bunch of those rods are put together in something that we call an assembly, a fuel assembly. And that's just a solid thing. It's metal and ceramic. And it goes, about 150 of these might be in a core or more. It really depends on the design of the reactor. And those are put into the core, and a third of them are swapped out every 18 months or 2 years. So once they are in there for that long, they start to degrade at the atomic level in a way that makes them bad for the reaction, and it basically causes the nuclear reactor to not be able to run anymore. So they have to take out some of those, and they move all the rest of them around so that they can try to use them up more fully. Once they do that, it's still the case that a very, very small percentage of the energy in those fuel assemblies has actually been used, but because of the changes to the material and the fuel pellets, they have to be taken out. So really just a couple of % of that energy is used. All the rest of it's in there, but it's not usable in that reactor. So we take those out and we put them into a spent fuel pool, which is like a big 40-foot deep swimming pool. They go at the bottom of that into an array. There's some supports that are in the bottom of the pool that you could just drop. These things, think of them as they're square or hexagonal maybe, and they're maybe, I don't know, 12 feet tall, 15 feet tall, something like that. and they go in the bottom half of that spent fuel pool, and that's just water that's in that pool. It's highly purified water, and that water does two things. It cools them because they're still generating heat because of the radioactive elements that are left over from the fission that happened in the reactor are still creating heat, and that heat it goes down pretty rapidly, but it does have to be removed, especially in the early stages of removal, so that it doesn't actually melt. That's how much it is. So, but after a few days, even that much heat is not there anymore. But they stay in the pool for 3 or 4 or 5 years, maybe more. Generally speaking, you put them in there until you have to take them out because you run out of room. The spent fuel pool generally has walls that are steel and concrete from between 4 and 6 feet thick. And it's seismically designed to withstand any seismic events that might happen in the area that it's been built. There have actually been people that have swam at the top of those in the water in those spent fuel pools at the top, because the water also shields the radiation very effectively. And if you're in the top part of that, at the top, few feet of that pool, you're going to get less radiation there than you would if you're out in the sun. So it's quite. They don't let you do that anymore, but there's a good comic strip that talks about that. The XKD comic strip. You find that spent fuel pool. You look that up on Google. You'll find it. So it stays in there and it cools. And when there's no more room, then those the oldest of the fuel assemblies can be pulled out and put into dry storage. So they're cool enough that they don't need the water to cool them anymore. So they put them in. They're called dry casks, and they're big steel and concrete barrels, really big steel and concrete barrels, and a dozen or 15 or 20 of these fuel assemblies might fit inside, and typically they have helium in them that circulates around and extracts the extra heat that you have, because they are still generating some heat. And that needs to be removed. But if you measure the radioactivity on the outside of one of these casks, it's background levels. It's not really, doesn't get through those because they're thick and they're thick enough to prevent that. And those concrete and steel dry casks are just out on a really thick concrete tarmac at the nuclear plant itself. So they're stored at the same place where they were used, and that's because we don't have any place else to send them right now. So the infrastructure, the security infrastructure of the plant protects them, just like it protects the rest of the plant. There's not particularly likely that anybody could do much with any of those casks. They're welded shut. They weigh 100 tons. You're not going to have a terrorist, walk in and, shoot an RPG at it or something and cause an issue. They're just they're impervious to basically anything that might happen, including a plane running into them. So, but that's where they are right now. The amount that we have, because the energy density of nuclear is so high, we get so much energy out of the uranium because we're using the fission, not we're using an atomic process, not a molecular chemistry process like we do with combustion. We get 1 million times more energy out of the same mass of uranium as we get from a piece of coal the same size. So because of that, we have relatively little amounts of this used fuel. That's what we call nuclear waste normally. That's what people are referring to. But I don't like to call it waste because, as I mentioned earlier, it's still got most of the energy in it. And we do have reactor designs that can take that material and reprocess it and use up the rest of that energy, and also reduce the amount of waste that comes out the other end by 2 orders of magnitude. So it's really, it's just waiting for us to use it for something like that. Uranium is not particularly expensive right now, so that's not really a high thing on most people's list. If you ask me, as long as people are concerned about nuclear waste and that's keeping us from building more nuclear reactors, then we probably should be building something that can burn it up and get rid of it and produce a lot of clean energy in the process. So I have a couple of slides that this is an example of a design that does that. The GE and Hitachi have a joint venture called GE Hitachi, and this is a PRISM reactor. This is based on work that was done at Idaho National Labs over the course of probably 30 years with the Experimental Breeder Reactor 2 project out there, and then they had 10 years of development of this type of a reactor. And GE recognized that this was, they hoped, going to be something that people would want. And so they took that work and they commercialized it. We have not seen any of these built yet, but basically GE is just waiting for customers. So we'll see what happens with that. But most of the reactor here is subterranean. You can see that sort of the bottom of the photo there. That's where the actual reactor is. The rest of it is just ancillary things that are that are required to actually produce the energy and change it into electricity. There's also, though, a processing hot cell, which can take the used fuel out of this reactor. And also, if you design it the right way, can take the used fuel from today's reactors that we have stacking up at nuclear plants today, that the stuff we call waste. And that could be taken and reprocessed and made into fuel for this reactor. So, and that all is done on site. It doesn't leave the site at all to do all that work. And again, this is work that was, the capabilities that was developed at Idaho National Labs. That particular project was called the Integral Fast Reactor, or the IFR. Some of the attributes of that reactor are you can fuel it on the nuclear waste, the stuff that we were just talking about. It also can take its own waste and recycle it. It's passively safe. So physically, it's designed, the physics of it mean that if I turn all the power off and the staff goes on strike and they all leave the site and the thing's running at full bore, if it gets hotter, if it gets too hot, then it'll actually just shut itself down. The physics of the design force it to do that, and there's no external power or mechanism that's required to make that happen. Essentially, what happens is it goes up to a certain level of power, which is above what you would normally want to operate it at. And then when it gets to that point, it'll start to shut itself down, and it'll reduce power down to a pretty low amount, and it'll just kind of oscillate at a very low level, indefinitely, as long as you just leave it there. And there's enough coolant. This is a sodium-cooled reactor, so it's a liquid sodium, and the mass of that and the ability to extract heat of that sodium pool is more than enough to get rid of all that heat, and do that for as long as it needs to be done. So, and they did experiments with this when they were running that project. They had people come in from around the world, and they said, okay, we're going to turn all the power off. And we watched the power level go up, and then it just kind of went down and never went back up again. So that's all reactors that are being designed today. All the new, we call them advanced nuclear reactor designs, all of them have passive safety of some sort or another. This is the way that it works with the PRISM, with the sodium-cooled fast reactor, but there are other designs that use different ways, but all of them are passive. And then this reactor is a 300 megawatts electric. So it'll generate 300 megawatts of electricity, and they have they generally would be built in pairs, so you get 600 megawatts. Up in Waukegan, there's a coal plant that's currently running. It's about 730 megawatts. It's owned by NRG, and it's been cited for polluting the groundwater with its coal ash, and it's kind of a dirty place. It's a coal plant, right? It's a coal plant, and it's in the middle of an area population. Theoretically, you could replace that coal plant with a pair of these, and come up with most of the extra energy that you need to fill that void. And actually, the design of a plant is such that you can have 3 of these dual reactor power modules there, but you don't have to build them all at once. And that's a pretty key thing, because the financing for a nuclear plant, the capital financing, is the biggest expense. The interest that you pay on the money that you have to borrow to build a nuclear plant is the biggest expense of the nuclear plant. It's not labor, it's not stuff, it's interest. The bankers get that money. So, and then ultimately the waste stream, because it does reprocess the waste until there's just nothing left in it, is a much smaller amount of waste, and that waste is only radiologically, we'll call it hot, for a few hundred years, maybe 300 years. So all of the things that take 10,000 or 15 or 100,000 years to kind of die out, those things are all burned up in this reactor in order to make, and I say burned, I don't really mean burned, but they're fissioned, they're used up, and they the only thing left is the short-lived thing. So the PRISM has a lot of promise. I hope that we'll see some of these built, but that gives you an idea of what one of the things that we could do with the waste. There are other things we could do with the waste, and just to be clear, when I first take a fuel assembly out of a nuclear reactor, after it's been used for a couple of years, or for 6 years, maybe it is, it's incredibly radioactive. If you went up and gave it a big bear hug because you love nuclear energy, you would die. You would die pretty quickly and pretty horribly. And it generates enough heat that it would also burn you. And it could melt itself if you just took it out and left it lie, out on, put it out on the tarmac or something. It would just melt, because there's so much energy that's still in it. That's why that spent fuel pool is used. But once it's been in there for even just a few weeks, much of that energy is gone, and it's still a dangerous thing to be very close to, and that's why they keep it under the water. But it's we really are very, very good at handling this stuff, and there's very small amount of it. So if somebody wanted to put a dry cask of used nuclear fuel in my backyard, I would have zero problems with that. There's kind of a joke that goes around. You can take some of those fuel rods and maybe put them into your driveway so you don't have to shovel it in the winter. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but so they're not particularly dangerous because we know how to handle them. And if there was a truck that had a bunch of these on it and it crashed, all you would have to do is keep people away from it. I mean, it's not, it's all solid material. It's not like green goo or anything like that. And there are forms of nuclear waste from weapons manufacturing that are harder to deal with, and that have not been dealt with as well as they should have been around the country at the different sites that do that. Generally speaking, none of those has anything to do with nuclear energy industry at all. Those are things that were done because of the weapons program, and the military does tend to cut corners sometimes. So that's a really long answer to a short question, and I think there's something in the chat here.
We have 2 in the chat. One is about the small modular nuclear reactors seen in Idaho Falls. Do you know about those?
Yeah, so Idaho is the home of Idaho National Labs. And there are companies that I mentioned earlier that are developing reactors that are new, and most of those are what we call small modular reactors. And they're small because instead of being a gigawatt in size or 1200 megawatts or some huge amount of energy like we have mostly today, instead of that, we have something less than 300. So this PRISM is barely on the edge of being a small modular reactor. Now, let me change my battery, hang on. So, but anywhere between, I'd say maybe 50 or 60 megawatts and 300, we would call it a small modular reactor. Anything less than 10, we would call a micro reactor. There's a company called NuScale, which is has progressed quite a way towards having a commercial product, and their product is I call it a 12-pack. It's a nuclear plant that has, you build the infrastructure for it. It has 12 slots in that infrastructure, and each of those slots, into each of those slots, you could put a completely separate autonomous nuclear reactor that doesn't depend on any of the other reactors that might be also installed there. And you can do that up to 12. So you can build this plant, started out with 60 megawatts, 60 megawatts, and this is called the NuScale Power Module. That's what those reactors are called. And they have plans to build one of these at Idaho National Labs to serve a number of communities sort of out that direction. It's actually a consortium that consists of quite a few different organizations. So that will actually be the first of those that gets built. Idaho National Labs is a huge place. It's got lots of land, and they know how to deal with nuclear things out there because they've done, most of the reactors that we built, and almost all the experimental reactors that we built have been there, that are of any size. And so they know how to do that, and they have facilities there that will help them be able to do that. So the NuScale design allows you to, again, start small. You build this little bit of infrastructure stuff. I mean, I say a little bit, I guess this is more than that, but you build the plant, but you don't have to populate it with all the reactors until you want to. So you can put one in there to start. You can add, one or more at any time, up to 12. And the total amount that you can then power could take over that coal plant if you put a fully populated one of these in Waukegan, where that energy coal plant is. It's a 720 megawatts is what you get from this a fully populated NuScale power plant. So that's an example. That power that reactor uses the same technology that we have today. Uses the same kind of fuel assemblies. It's going to have the same kind of used fuel that comes out the other side. So we'll still have to deal with that. But it part of the reason they did that is because there's a supply chain for all of those things in existence today, right now. And if you build a different kind of nuclear reactor that needs a different kind of fuel and different other things, then you have to go find companies that are going to provide those things to you. And so that's extra steps that you have to take. So NuScale has gotten their design licensed. And they're doing some additional, I don't even remember what the next step is, but over the next couple of years, they'll be finish up some of that, but they do expect to have the first of these installed in 2024 out at Idaho National Lab. So one of the key things about the small modular reactors is that you can build them in factories. Instead of doing like a stick-built house, you have a modular house, right? And, which just kind of rolls down the highway, on the back of a, behind a semi tractor, and you put two of those together, and they form a house. That's probably a bad analogy, but essentially you can take advantage of the expertise and the quality control and the control of everything that you have in a factory, much more so than you can if you try to build something in a field. So the reactors are built in a factory. Once we build a few of those, we'll learn from that we'll be, that those factories will get better at that, just like they do today with any other product that we make. So that'll drive costs down as we go forward. So that's one of the key. That's one of the key benefits of a small modular reactor, is that they're small enough you can do that. So you can put these modules on a specialized train car, or even on a semi trailer, and move it to site that way. So.
That's great. We have one more question about decommissioning.
Yes.
Do nuclear reactors have a useful life that then requires them to decommission, and are the costs of decommissioning factored into the cost of power over the lifetime of the reactor?
Yeah, okay. So the nuclear plants, when they were built, all of the ones that we have today, and I think even the new ones, have a 40-year license, 40-year license. That's just kind of an arbitrary number that somebody came up with, where we thought that they would last at least that long, but we didn't have any experience with anything that had run nearly that long at the time, so that's what we did. The plants that we have today, almost all of them are being relicensed to run at least 60 and some of them 80 years, depending on when they were built. So the useful life of a nuclear plant, like we have today, is not really known. There isn't really a defined end to it. The two components that are probably the things that we need to pay most attention to, when they get to be really old, are going to be the reactor pressure vessel, which is the 6-inch thick steel vessel within which the reaction actually happens. And then, of course, the containment building around it. So those things we can't change out easily. Virtually all of the components in a nuclear plant get refurbished or replaced over the life of that plant. The plants that we have here in Illinois, almost everything in there has been upgraded or refurbished or replaced at some point in its life, and that's part of the reason why they are generating much more electricity now than they were when they first started, because they're up more of the time, and in I think all cases they've been what we call uprated, which means that we've improved some things that allow us to actually generate more electricity than it was originally designed to do. So we have turbines that are bigger, or we have there's it's a whole system. So you have to do many things for that, but then you have to get licensed for the extra capacity to be able to sell it, to be able to run it and sell it. So the decommissioning money, the money that we have to tear the thing down when it's finally done, the money that we're using, at Zion to take that thing apart, is part of the rate that the nuclear plant charges for its electricity. A little piece of that, a very small piece of that, gets put into a fund, an escrow fund or a trust fund or whatever you want to call it, and it builds up over the life of the plant, the entire life of the plant. So if you run the plant longer, you'll have more of that money, which is good. But generally speaking, the idea is to pay for the decommissioning of that plant as it operates, so that you don't have a big old bill at the end of it, and you don't want to do it and it doesn't get done. So so that's how that's. I wish that more things that we had were built that way, and had that had that capability. I mean, if we had that with coal plants, we'd be able to deal with the ash ponds and the other things without having to come up with money some other way to do that. So so there's a plan. All nuclear plants have it, and they use it when they close.
Yeah, I worked at Idaho National Laboratory for 2 years in the late 90s, and I did work on nuclear materials, and it's things like the cladding on the fuel rods, which is made of zirconium, gets heavily bombarded with neutrons, and it degrades because of that, and less so the reactor steel outside. So there's a lot of materials constraints on nuclear reactors. But, you know, I think they're, you know, if you're aware of where the problems can arise, I don't think it's terribly difficult to control. So that's one of the reasons why the fuel rods don't actually last forever. They tend to creep, or the materials can degrade.
Right. So a couple other questions I was going to try to get to. If we have, do we have
Yeah, go
time
ahead.
for that, Cindy?
You know, people can leave if they need to. Most of us are stuck.
No, our plans are on hold. So one of the questions in here asked about accidents. We have had really 3 major accidents, nuclear accidents in history of nuclear power over the last 60 years or so. The only one that actually resulted in any deaths was the one at Chernobyl and the Ukraine, former USSR. And you know, many of you have probably seen the HBO miniseries, which is quite well done. It was really good TV. There were some facts in there that I didn't really agree with, but it was quite compelling to watch and pretty scary in some ways. So that accident happened at a reactor that had no containment around it. So all of the reactors, all the power reactors in the Western world have a big containment dome or a containment, you know, might be a box-shaped thing, but it's a very, very thick, very robust enclosure that keeps that protects the reactor from things on the outside and protects things on the outside from the reactor. So if there's a radiation leak of some sort in the radioactive part of the nuclear plant, that's going to be in the containment building and it's going to be contained there. That's what happened at 3 Mile Island. We had a partial meltdown of a core there. It was a very, very expensive accident. It cost, you know, the $5 billion nuclear plant was, you know, got bricked as a result of that because of a lot of different errors that happened in kind of a perfect storm sequence. But nobody was hurt by that. There was a little puff of radioactive gas that went out, but it wasn't enough for anybody to be hurt. And so that's, if had we had one of those at Chernobyl around that reactor, you know, we wouldn't be talking about Chernobyl probably really at all. But we did not have that. And there were other aspects of that reactor design that were pretty bad. And some of the training wasn't particularly good for the operators that they had there. You know, they had their heroes in the firefighters that fought it and everything, but the actual death toll there, you know, depending on how you decide to measure it, is less than 150 or maybe even less than 50. So, you know, some of the people that died pretty horrible deaths, the ones that got heavily irradiated. But the idea that large numbers of people were affected, you know, by you know, all the radiation that flowed out over the Ukraine and over Europe and other places that were, you know, even thousands of miles away, you could still measure it. There weren't really health effects from those things. There was some thyroid cancers that probably happened. And those could have been avoided if they would have given out iodine pills or even told the people not to let their children drink the milk for the next couple of months, but you know, right after the accident. But the Soviet Union did not do that. It was badly managed in that sense, and so it was made more dangerous as a result of that. The third accident, Fukushima. The Fukushima Prefecture has a power plant called Fukushima Daiichi, which has 4 reactors. Those reactors were overwhelmed by a tsunami that came in there. It was bigger than the seawall that they had built. They had actually been told to build the seawall higher, and they did not do that. So because of that, the infrastructure of that plant was decimated. The reactors themselves had already been shut down when the earthquake happened. The earthquake didn't damage. That was like the fourth biggest earthquake we've ever had in the entire world, and that did not damage any of the nuclear reactors in Japan. And they have a lot of nuclear reactors, 40 or 50 of them. And so all of the reactors that were in a place where the quake happened, they automatically shut down like they're supposed to. And these had also, but as we talked about earlier, the residual heat from the fuel, even after you shut the reactor down, is significant, especially initially, right away. So if you don't cool that, you don't take that heat away for a couple, 3 days at least, it will melt. And that's what happened at 3 of those 4 reactors. The 4th one had been shut down for refueling, so it wasn't affected in any. It didn't have any melting down at all, but the other 3 did. So it was a triple meltdown, and there was a couple of hydrogen explosions that resulted from hydrogen gas buildup in the buildings because of the reaction that the water and the zirconium have at high temperatures. Morton mentioned zirconium. So it was kind of a mess, but nobody got hurt by the radiation at Fukushima at all. Lots of people got hurt because they were dragged out of their homes or their hospital rooms or whatever and evacuated, but they didn't really need to do most of that. And we know that now. Lots of people knew that then. The way that the Japanese government chose, and TEPCO, the power company, the way that they chose to respond to that resulted in a massive panicky evacuation, and lots of people died. 1,500 people died because of that, for all the various reasons, and it's sad because they could have sheltered in place like what we're doing, except for a much smaller period of time, and it would have been just as safe. And they wouldn't have had to leave their homes. They wouldn't have had to leave their hospital rooms. They wouldn't have had to leave the places that were familiar with them, that had the support that they needed. I mean, if you have an IV in your arm and, somebody tells you you have to move, somebody's got to manage that IV for you. Somebody's, and these people ended up in gymnasiums and places. Some of them ended up in a nuclear plant that was up the road, another one that had a higher seawall, and it served as a place for people to shelter because it wasn't damaged, because they had the higher seawall, and people went there for refuge. So, a lot of people think of the Fukushima meltdowns as a real nuclear disaster. I look at it as proof that nuclear energy, even when you throw the worst things you can at it, is not particularly dangerous. And the track record that nuclear energy has in terms of people dying is almost perfect. If you throw Chernobyl out, there's basically nobody that's been hurt by radiation from nuclear plants. Certainly not in the U.S.
I'd like to say, though, that the environment was devastated, and it continues to be. And
well, it's that the levels of radiation there are not really any higher in most places than they are in Denver, Colorado, for instance. They are not. They took a long time to allow people to return, which is a problem because now there's lots of people that, I don't really have anything to go back to. Obviously, there's lots of devastation. The tsunami was really the big disastrous news there. And
can I get in here for a second?
Sure.
Hey, yeah. So I just wanted to say something. Did anybody see a news article or a series of news articles recently that were like, "Oh, there's forest fires at Chernobyl and there's more radiation now"? Anybody see that one? It was like last week. A few different outlets covered it. You saw it? Yeah, okay. So I did too, and I'm always a little wary of stories like that because I've been burned a few times. So that one, I was like, all right, well, what are we talking about here? And they said that radiation levels had quotes spiked to 24 to 36 microsieverts per hour. And I was like, wait, how much is that? Or sorry, 2.4 to 3.4 microsieverts per hour. So I did the math on that. And if you compare that to bananas, which have naturally occurring potassium-40 in them, which is a radioactive isotope that is always found with potassium-39, the stable part that we need to survive. So the radiation levels, quote unquote, spiked the equivalent of 24 to 36 bananas worth per hour. And it's just like, why was this international news? It wasn't enough that's ever been demonstrated to hurt anybody, but it's very, very clickbaity. So I would just say, like, you guys know how much fake news there is about there. Just be, very skeptical consumers of news.
Yeah, I mean, I know people who lived in Poland during, were kids during the Chernobyl disaster, and they had to have thyroid operations, as a consequence of radioactive fallout from that. But, I think the perspective, so nuclear is not, yes, nuclear, there are hazards associated with nuclear. I mean, and the design was pretty bad at Chernobyl. I think there's a lot of good literature out there about how many mistakes were made at Chernobyl. So probably some of those mistakes we know enough now that we wouldn't make them again. But the perspective that I think is important here is that our fossil fuel use is really very, very dangerous. And putting the big picture together and basically our energy use is a dangerous thing, and we're running risks in many ways, and some of them are more hidden than others. And I think nuclear has to be viewed in the perspective of the big picture of what our energy use is doing to the earth. And if you do that, it actually doesn't, I think a lot of what Alan has said is pretty valid, that it looks pretty good, and it looks,
there's a very real world confirmation of what you're saying right now.
The track record and the amount of safe carbon dioxide free power that comes out of nuclear is definitely just not something that you can walk away from. So
yeah, in New York at the end of the month here, they're going to start shutting down Indian Point, which that's a nuclear power plant there is responsible for generating 80% of New York City and the rest of downstate New York's clean electricity. 80% of that, 2 units there. And there's already been studies on the air quality. They've built 2 natural gas plants to replace it already. Recently finished those. And there have been studies on the air quality impacts of shutting the plants down, and they're estimating an additional 150 deaths per year from respiratory conditions as a result of recarbonizing to fossil fuels there. And it doesn't ever seem like that is brought into the equation when the nuclear safety discussion is happening. Like, how dangerous is air pollution? So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Morten. Yeah.
It's more hidden. It's less dramatic.
Exactly. Driving versus flying.
Right. Well, we're losing our audience, and so I just wanted to give people a chance to visit a little bit before we go on. Is there any pressing questions? Oh, geez, you guys keep leaving. Keep losing you.
I will provide you with a PDF of this presentation.
Excellent.
You can distribute it however you like. It has your logo on it.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, we just wanted to thank Alan. It was a really good presentation, and I've always been a firm believer in or supporter of nuclear energy. So I appreciate the bill that you put to our attention to contact our legislature. And, you know, we appreciate all the work that you're doing on behalf of nuclear. I think it's really time well spent and really.
Thanks. As you can see, I don't really like talking about it.
Ah, well, I think it was very informative. Very informative.
Yes,
thank you
very
much.
much so. Very much so.
I will also send you a link to a really good quality of that song that Eric sang. He made a music video
Oh, good.
out at Idaho National Labs in one of the museums there, and
Yeah.
it's pretty good. The lip syncing is awesome.
Well, and for everybody who's not on our email list, or if you want to join our Facebook page, we might be virtual next month, Green Drinks Park Ridge, or Park Ridge Green Drinks, I don't know which is. We don't have a speaker yet, though. So feel free to join us if we're virtual. And again, for those who weren't here at the beginning, it is tomorrow's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So hopefully you do something to celebrate. Be kind to the earth.
Plant a tree.
Plant a tree.
Yeah, that's a good.
Thank you. Thanks.
Plant something. Cheers.
You'd have to leave your house to get one, but cheers. Cheers to
All right, cheers.
There's
Guys,
Green drinks.
Thanks a lot,
We're
Alan.
going to do the Citizens Climate Lobby. We're going to be involved in the Citizens
Oh, right, yeah.
Climate Lobby.
On Saturday,
Yes, I signed up
there's
for it, Wharton,
Yeah, lobby.
on
yeah,
Saturday.
there's a Saturday Citizens Climate Lobby event in celebration of Earth
That's
Day.
right. Yeah.
And
Tell us
it's going to feature Catherine Hayhoe,
Oh yeah, I saw that.
who's very good. And yeah, do you get the emails and have the information about that? I don't know if you.
I signed up for the email. I did get that.
Yeah, I know you did. I saw that. Excellent. I appreciate that so much.
Yes, I sent it out to Action Ridge, so I hope there'll be a few people
Beautiful.
listening
Okay.
in.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Now, we got to do something on Earth Day,
Yeah.
since we can't go anywhere.
Every day.
Right. Every day is Earth Day. Right.
That's true.
Yeah,
Every day.
Earth Day, but let's make that let's let that motivate us for, when we can be more active again. Let's make stuff happen here.
Yes, absolutely.
That's right.
Yep.
And you're going to come speak to Action Ridge, Wharton. Thank you very much.
I'd love to,
Get up
yeah.
and running again.
Looking forward to that.